Hello everyone, welcome to IMPRINT IS. I'm Varun Kular, and today we're continuing with chapter number 9, that is Consolidation of India as a Nation, the Integration of Tribes, right? So let's start this chapter. Now, understand that this integration of chapter tribes requires a lot of background knowledge. I will advise you to go through a couple of PDFs in the description, right? But we still try to cover as much as possible here. We'll also be covering a chapter from the Ramchandra Guha book on tribals, right? So I think we should be able to cover most of it, right? So let's continue to start. Okay. So the task of integrating the tribals into the mainstream is actually very complex even today, right? Considering the fact the parts they live in, right? So they're geographically isolated areas, right? Then they have distinct cultures and distinct language, right? Sometimes they're not even willing to talk to the people who are from outside, right? So just to have a look and a brief analysis of the tribal community in India. So we look at the 1971 census. The 2011 census basically says that there are more than 104.5 million people, and with the maximum number of people living in Madhya Pradesh, right? But in the 71 census, there were 400 tribal communities and 38 million people, constituting 6.9% of the population of India. And as it's mentioned before, as I've talked about before, the greatest concentration is in Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, Odisha, and then the northeastern regions, then West Bengal, Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Rajasthan, right? And except in the northeast, there are minorities in the home state, and we'll talk about the problem that they face actually in Jharkhand in a bit, right? So residing mostly in the hills and forest areas in colonial India, they lived in relative isolation, and their traditions, habits, cultures were always markedly different from their non-tribal neighbors, right? And also, they actually had interacted, except in Northeast, for with the non-tribals, culturally, socially, economically, and politically. But what happened was the colonialism brought a radical transformation of the tribals as the relative isolation was eroded by the penetration of market forces. Now, for the first time when the Britishers came, they were integrated with the British and princely administration, right? A large number of traders, moneylenders, revenue officials, etc. They invaded the tribal areas, they disrupted their traditional way of life. And what happened was the tribal was increasingly engulfed in debt and lost the lands to outsiders, right? So that was one of the biggest problems. What happened was that during the British rule, they suffered oppression and exploitation. For there soon came merchants, liquor vendors, cajoling, tricking, swindling them into in their ignorance and simplicity, until bit by bit their broad acres dwindled and they sank into poverty, in which many of them live today. And simultaneously, the missionaries were destroying their art, their dances, their weaving, and their whole culture, right? So that was what Venier Elvin, who basically lived all his life among the tribal people in central and northeastern India. He's a foreigner who actually made India his home, and he's one of the makers of modern India, right? In Ramchandra's book, right, as Makers of Modern India. Then we have, let's look at what happened. The colonialism actually transformed the tribal's relationship with the forest. They depended on the forest for fuel, on food, on cattle, on raw material, etc. They, typically to conserve forest and to facilitate state commercial exploitation. What happened was now the colonial authorities brought large tracts of forest land under forest laws, which basically changed the way the tribals actually could use the forest. They had very limited access to forest products and the use of forest. So what happened to them, if you think about it, with the British rule? So they had loss of land, indebtedness, exploitation by middlemen, denial of access to forest and the forest products, oppression and extortion by policemen, forest officials, and other government officials. It basically led to tribal uprising in the 19th century, in the 20th century. So we have the Santhal uprising, we have the Munda rebellion by Bursa Munda, right? So this, if you actually go through the tribal uprising chapter of the Bipin Chandra book, you'll find that a lot of them happened actually. So the question after independence came, what should be India's tribal policy? So Jawaharlal Nehru was the main influence in shaping the government's attitude towards the problem, towards the tribals, and he said that the first problem we have to face there in the tribal areas is to inspire them. with confidence and to make them feel at one with India and to realize that they're a part of India and have an honored place in it, right? At the same time, India to them should not only signify a protecting force but a liberating one. Indian nationalism, Nehru thought, was capable of accommodating the uniqueness of tribal people, right? Now, nevertheless, there were two approaches to the tribal in India, and one of the approach was to leave the tribals alone, uncontaminated by the modern influences operating outside their world, and to let them stay more or less as they were. Now, the second approach was obviously the fact that you can't keep them isolated, and they have to be assimilated into Indian society as soon as possible. So what should we choose, right? So the problem became that Nehru thought that none of them would actually work. He says the first approach would be treating the tribal people as museum specimen to be observed and written about, and what he said was to insult them, right? He said that the tribal people could not be left cut off from the world as they were. Isolation was in any case not possible in this age, and for the process of penetration by the outside world, especially, had gone too far, and it was not possible or desirable to isolate them. The second approach of allowing them to be engulfed by the masses of Indian humanity or the assimilation through the operation of normal outside forces was also wrong, because Nehru thought that it would just lead to the loss of tribal culture and cultural identity and the many virtues they possessed. Right? What he thought was that if normal factors are allowed to operate, people from outside would take possession of tribal lands and forests and interfere with the life of forest tribal people. This would also upset their whole life and culture, which had so much of good in them, right? So understand what Nehru thought. So the two basic parameters on the Nehruvian approach was the tribal areas have to progress, and they have to progress in their own way. So this is the cornerstone of tribal policy, of Nehruvian policy. Progress did not basically mean what progress meant in other parts of India. It was not to duplicate what was in other parts of India and tribal areas. But the idea was whatever was good in the tribal areas would be adopted by them in the tribal areas, right? And whatever changes they should be decided by the tribals themselves. Okay. Now, obviously, the question came, how can this be done? So, because Nehru stood for the economic and social development of tribals in multifarious ways, especially in fields of medical communication, right, medicine, communication, agriculture, education, etc. So, what he basically did was he laid broad guidelines for the. He said that tribal should develop, along the lines of their own genius. There should be no imposition or compulsion from outside. The non-tribals should not approach them with a superiority complex. Now, this is one of the problems that we keep on seeing in either Northeast, right, especially Nagaland, Mizoram, etc. Right. Rather, the understanding should be they should have an equal contribution to make to the evolution of common culture and social life of uh, the country. Now, the second was the fact that tribal rights in land and forest should be respected, and no outsider should be made to take the possession of these lands. Right, the incursion of the market economy to tribal areas had to be strictly controlled and regulated. Right. Third, it was necessary to encourage tribal language, which must be given all support and conditions which they can flourish and must be safeguarded. Right, and this is actually mentioned in the even in the Indian Constitution. Fourth, for tribal administration, reliance should be placed on the tribal people themselves, and administrators should be recruited from themselves and then be trained. Fifth, there should be no over administration of tribal areas. The effort should be to administer and develop them through tribals' own cultural and social institutions. Uh, Obviously, Nehru's approach was actually based on what was Gandhi's approach when he set up ashrams in tribal areas and promoted constructive work. Right. To give shape to this policy, a beginning was made itself in the Constitution under Article 46, in which special care for the educational and economic interest of tribal people has been mentioned in, Article 46. Right. And the governments of these states were, tribal areas were given special responsibilities under Schedule 5 and Schedule 6, right, to basically frame laws for protection of tribal right to land and also the protection from moneylenders. But what has happened is that despite the fact that we have, all these tribal advisory councils, we have a commission for tribal scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, somehow these have not been as effective as they should have been. And what we see is actually, uh, a lot of Naxalism in these areas. So, the book basically talks about the fact that, except in the northeast, the tribals continue to be poor, indebted, landless, and often unemployed. And obviously, the problem often lies in the weak execution of even well-intentioned measures. There's a divergence between the center and state policies, the latter being less in tune with the tribal interests, because it's basically when who is actually running the government in those areas, and it's the non-tribal people. And they obviously want to grab the area and the resources of the tribal areas, right? And quite often we find the funds allocated for the tribal welfare are not being spent or are even being misappropriated, right? And as I mentioned before, the tribal advisory council have not been functioning well, right? So what has happened, if you have sympathetic officials, they have been just been transferred out under the pressure of traders, moneylenders, forest contractors, and land grabbers. So this is one of the big issues, right? The other thing is the tribals actually have no idea about the laws and the legal system, right? Laws preventing transfer of land to outsiders have continued to be evaded, leading to alienation of land and eviction of the tribal. Rapid extension of mines and industries have happened in Jharkhand, in other areas, or which are tribal, Chhattisgarh, etc. And deforestation proceeds with the cooperation of corrupt officials, politicians, with forest contractors. The tribal's traditional right to the forest and its produce is continually curtailed, right? We have the PESA, that is the Panchayati Act extension to scheduled areas, but it is the most poorly implemented act of parliament. Okay, so what is actually happening is the tribal people have been continually facing unemployment and increasingly driven into more inaccessible stretches of hills and jungles, right? Further, the education, big among tribal people has been poor. The state governments have tended to neglect tribal languages and education towards freedoms. A lot of things in our constitution are actually namesake, and this is one of them, right? Tribal society almost everywhere has gradually developing a class difference and a class structure, and with those basically belonging to the upper class now join the outside forces, right? Because they feel that now they can actually get the benefits of the economic growth. And what has happened at a culture of tribal elites have happened. So typically, it's not really helping out. Uh, what actually is happening is that now tribals are actually looking for a greater and more active political role and acquiring increasing representation in different political structure and institutions. There have been protest movements among tribals out of the frustration. I've already talked about Naxalism in Chhattisgarh and in parts of Andhra and even in uh, as and obviously what has happened is there has been strong state action against them, and somehow they have been seen to be anti-nationals, right? I think the only anti-nationals here are the people who have actually taken land away from them. The growing tribal antagonism towards the non-tribal or outsiders in tribal areas have obviously is one of the biggest other unfortunate development, right? Some of the outsiders have been a scourge for the tribal areas, but many outsiders also have actually settled down and also outnumbering the tribals in almost all tribal areas outside the northeast. So what has happened is that the outsiders have come and actually settled in tribal areas. So this is one of the big problems also. But maybe the idea is that they can actually live together and learn from each other, right? So what should we do? So remember now that tribals cannot expect to revert to isolation from their non-tribal neighbors and to prevent massive interaction with them, including their in-migration. So we actually need to promote interest of tribals with mutual cooperation with people within the non-tribals living in those tribal areas. Now we're picking up a new topic because right now you're talking about central India mainly. Now we look at tribals in the northeast. Now tribes in the northeast consist of over 100 group, right? There are majority in their areas. They speak majority a variety of languages. They live in the hill tracts of Assam, right? They do share a lot of features and problems of tribal people in the rest of the country, but they're the majority in the areas they inhabit, and the non-tribals have not penetrated into these areas. Why they have not done so? Because of the British policy in the 19th century. The tribal areas occupied with the British were then formed a part of the Assam province, but were given a special separate administrative status. So no non-tribal plainsmen were allowed to acquire land in tribal areas, because of which the tribals suffer little loss of land, right? So if you're an outsider, you can't actually have land in these areas. But the British government, what they did was they encouraged Christian missionaries to move and establish schools, hospitals, churches, right, and also increase Christianity, right. So there are a lot of tribals in the northeast are actually Christians. These missionaries, kept the nationalist influence outside the tribal areas, and they actually encouraged the isolation from the rest of the population of India and Assam. And the virtual absence of the cultural or political contact of the tribals in the northeast with the political life of the rest of India is a striking difference. So when we got independent, Nehru actually thought that this is going to be a big problem. He says the essence of our struggle for freedom was the unleashing of a liberating force in India. This force has not even affected the frontier people in one of the most important tribal areas. Thus, they have never experienced a sensation of being in a country like India, and they were hardly influenced by the struggle for freedom or any outside movement. So what basically Nehru said was the only influence that these people have felt, that is Arunachal Pradesh, right, that is NEFA, right, was of the British officers and of missionaries. And basically what they did was they tried to make them anti-Indian. They never made them think that they were Indian. So what did Nehru think? What should we do to the people of the Northeast? He said all the Northeast border state area deserves a special attention, right? Not only the governments but the people of India, right? Our contacts with them will do us good and will do good to them also, right? Because they add to our strength, our variety and richness, right? And this was reflected in the sixth schedule of the constitution, which only applied to the tribal areas of Assam, right? And this sixth schedule actually is one of the cornerstones of the freedom of the Northeast. If actually we had something of the fifth schedule, right, I think these people would have also lost all their land to the rest of the other Indians, right? There would have been elite capturing. Actually, one of the saddest things which I always felt about this fifth schedule is the fact that I think the tribal people of the central India were not smart enough to actually demand something similar, right? So what does the sixth schedule has? It offers a fair degree of self-government to the tribal people by providing autonomous districts and the creation of district and regional councils, which would exercise some of the legislative and judicial functions within the overall jurisdiction of the Assam legislature and parliament. Okay, so right, so what happened was Nehru's and Vernier Elvin's policies were implemented best of all in the NEFA, that is the Northeast Frontier Agency, which was created out of the border areas of Assam. NEFA was actually established as a union territory outside the jurisdiction of Assam and was placed under special administration. All right, and obviously special cadre was also there, right? Today also it's in the UT cadre. Okay, a measure of isolation combined with a sympathetic, imaginative policy of progressive administration created a situation unparalleled in the other parts of India. NEFA finally was named Arunachal Pradesh and was granted a separate state in 1987. Right. So, but in time, what happened was the problems arose. So, what were those problems? The basic problem was that these hill tribes had no cultural affinity with the people of Assam and Bengali presence of the plains, and they were very afraid of losing their identities, and they were actually afraid of the policy of Assamization, right? So, this Assamization basically led to resentment and a demand for a separate hill state, and this basically started in the mid 50s. In time, right, what happened was Assamese leaders then moved in the 1960s to make Assamese the sole language of the state. Now, in various political parties, the hill areas, typically merge into the all-party Hill Leaders Conference and demand a separate state within the Indian Union. The passage of the Assam Official Language Act, right, and the refusal of use of tribal languages in administration led to strong reaction. And what happened was, in time, in 1969, Meghalaya was carved out of Assam, right? Initially, they used to actually share the Assam High Court, right? Now we have a different, Meghalaya High Court, right? In 1972, finally Meghalaya became a separate state, right? And incorporating the Garo, Khasi, Jantia tribes, and simultaneously Union Territory of Manipur and Tripura was also granted statehood. So please commit this to memory that in 1972 this happened. Okay. Now, obviously, in time, what happened was the other states, that Nagaland and Mizoram, they also developed reactionary insurgency movements. So, what happened in Nagaland? First of all, let's try to understand who are the Nagas. So, Nagas are the inhabitants of the northeast frontier of the Assam-Burma border, and they number nearly 500,000 in 1961. They constitute less than 0.1% of the Indian population, consisting of the separate tribes speaking different languages. What happened was a section of the Naga leadership arose. Obviously they opposed integration, right? Because what happened was the government followed a policy of integrating the Naga areas with the state of Assam and India as a whole. So AZPZO demanded separation from India and complete independence, and the Britishers and the missionaries also encouraged this. So, 1955, a separate this Nagas declared the formation of independent Indian government. So now Nehru basically said that it does not help in dealing with tough people to have weakness. So basically, he actually um, didn't like the fact that they did violence. So, what he did was actually he actively made sure that the army was sent to Nagaland in 1956 to suppress this insurgency and restore peace and order. So, but what also Nehru did was at the same time was to integrate, the Nagas in mind and spirit, and we favor that. Let's give them autonomy in culture and other matters, but they should definitely join India and be a part of India, and there should be no succession definitely. So what happened was the more moderate leaders under Dr. O came into the fore, right, and the state of Nagaland came into existence in 1963. But still, the same problem insurgency is still partially there, and we recently had a Naga Accord. Right, please go through that. We'll talk about that a little later. All right, videos itself. But if you get a chance, please look at it. Then we look at Mizoram, which also had a similar issue, right? We had separatist demands by the Mizo leadership as well. And if you think about it, if I just want to comment about the Mizoram insurgency, I feel this has been the biggest success of handling an insurgency in India, right? And they have been totally been integrated, right? And why did this happen? It was because of Lal Denga was the president of the Mizo National Front, and when there was actually finally the government actually suppressed them, finally, you know. They actually became the chief minister itself. So Mr. Denga actually became the chief minister of Mizoram. Okay. So just to have a timeline, right? So on March 66, MNF declared independence from India and proclaimed a military uprising and attacked military and civilian targets. Most of the hardcore Mizo leaders, they escaped to the Pakistan, that is Eastern Pakistan, that is Bangladesh now. In 1973, the less Mizo extremist leaders scaled down the demands of a separate to that of a separate state with the Indian Union. And they just said that okay, let's give us a different state from different from Assam. And what happened was they were first given the status of union territory, and finally in '87 a separate state. So this actually really is one of the biggest success of Indian, handling an insurgency, which hasn't really happened in Kashmir or in Nagaland or other areas, right? Jharkhand, okay. Let's look at now the next area, which is very different from the areas we talked about. That is Arunachal, Tripura, Meghalaya, Nagaland, and Mizoram. Jharkhand is a tribal area in Bihar, right? Now, obviously, it's a separate state. It consists of a Chota Nagpur and Santhal Parganas and has for decades spawned movements for state autonomy. Right? Who are the tribes here? Santal, Ho, Oraon, and Munda. Please note these. You should remember these tribes where they're located. So basically, in case of objective type question comes here, you should be able to answer it. So the land holding pattern among tribals is unequal and skewed as among in tribals. The Jharkhand tribes obviously share some specific features with the other tribes, but they have the same features. That is, they've lost their land to outsiders, suffered from indebtedness, they have lost employment and low agriculture productivity, right? If you look at the 1951 census, scheduled tribes had 31% population in Chota Nagpur area, right, and 30% or 30.94 in 1971. In Santal Parganas, it was 44%, right? Then it became 36%. So nearly two-thirds of Jharkhand population is non-tribal, right? So now here becomes a huge problem. But what happened was both tribals and non-tribals were equally exploited, right? There were poor peasants, agricultural laborers, mining and industrial workers. So it was the outsiders who actually, the Biharis, the northern Biharis, who were exploiting them. So what happened was they wanted a formation of a separate tribal state. But obviously, the problem became that the population composition of Jharkhand did not allow this. So you could not have linguistic division of Jharkhand. Initially, there was a Jharkhand party, founded under the Oxford educated Jayapal Singh, and he got 32 seats in Chota Nagpur area, and was the main opposition party in the Bihar Assembly. But uh, in the State Reorganization Committee, as I said, the commission rejected the demand for a separate Jharkhand, as it did not have a common language. So in time, obviously, the movement faded away. What happened with 1967 onwards was the formation of the Jharkhand Mukti Morcha. Shibu Soren was one of its most charismatic leaders, and basically what they said was that whether tribal or non-tribal, you were exploited by the northern Biharis. So basically, what you should do is that we all should come together and work for Jharkhand. Right? JMM basically turned to a radical ideology in some time. It was even helped by the left Marxist group, right? And they basically organized a lot of violence, right, on the issues of alienated land, money-lend exploitation, employment of tribals and mines, etc. Right? And Shibu Soren, as I mentioned, was the great leader of the 1970s. Uh, but in time, finally, Jharkhand finally became a state, right, and was carved out of right, the state of Bihar, right. So I think everybody knows about this. Jharkhand is actually very, very beautiful. It was actually formed on 15th of November 2000, right, after a long struggle. So think about when it started. That is in the 1950, and in 2000, it took 50 years for Jharkhand, right? And right now, the chief minister is Raghu Das of the BJP, in case you are not aware of it. Stop here. If you have any questions, right, about the tribal uh, chapter, please let us know. Right. Okay. Thank you so much.